Modern data shows that over recent years, female killers have used poison in less than 1% of the murders they have committed. But there was once a time when poison was seen as a murderess's go-to method for committing their wicked crimes. In this compilation, we explore several such cases. We begin with the story of Mary Ann Cotton, a killer who often targeted those closest to her. Before looking in more depth at Mary Ann Cotton's life and grisly marriages, let's briefly examine the very phenomenon of serial killers. It is generally understood that there have been serial killers throughout history. For instance, the Roman historian Livy described a ring of female poisoners who were active in Rome in the middle of the 4th century BC in his monumental work Ab Urbe Condita. In the mid-15th century, the Breton nobleman Gilles de Rais allegedly abducted and killed well over 100 people. Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess often referred to as the Blood Countess, is believed to have kidnapped possibly hundreds of people from the countryside surrounding her castle and had them tortured to death. Yet, there are suspicions around a great many of these examples that the charges brought against the individuals involved were politically motivated. Moreover, many of those involved were of the upper classes and often had willing accomplices. The incidences of psychotic serial killers acting on their own and seemingly murdering people at random are more of a modern phenomenon. It developed as society became more urbanized and it became possible for people to cover up their crimes, and also as the methods which one might use to kill somebody increased. A person wielding an axe in a small village in 15th century England would probably be found out quite quickly, whereas a person poisoning strangers in a vast Victorian city was more likely to escape detection, particularly in an age before CCTV, fingerprinting, and DNA evidence. As such, the first famous instances of serial killers emerged during the 19th century when Jack the Ripper, H.H. Holmes, and others carried out their grisly work. Mary Ann Cotton was amongst these. The woman who is known to posterity as Mary Ann Cotton was actually born Mary Ann Robson on October the 31st, 1832 at Low Moorsley in the county of Durham in the northeast of England. Cotton was her married name from her 4th marriage. Her family were not well off, and her father, Michael, worked as a colliery sinker, a man who dug shafts in the coal mines of northern England. The circumstances were made worse in 1842, when Mary Ann was 9 years old, as her father fell 150 feet through a mine shaft he was helping sink and died. Destitute and now without a home, the Robsons' cottage having been granted to them by the South Hetton Coal Company, which Michael worked for, Mary Ann's mother quickly married again to George Stott. The coal company did compensate the family to some extent, paying for Mary Ann and her brother Robert to attend boarding school. After that, Mary Ann returned to South Hetton in Durham and began training as a dressmaker. The tough circumstances of her upbringing may have made her particularly anxious about financial security, a factor which might explain her subsequent behavior in some part, though it in no way justifies it. In 1852, when she was 20 years of age, Mary Ann married for the first time to William Mowbray, a coal miner, as many other men in northern England were at the height of Britain's Industrial Revolution. They were married for over 12 years, living for a time in the English West Country before returning to the industrial North. To the outside world, theirs was a tragic union. There are unconfirmed reports that while living in the West Country, Mary Ann gave birth to at least 4 children, each of them dying young. The curse apparently followed the pair back north, as several more children would pass away there, seemingly of gastric fever. It must be remembered in any assessment of this that even though medical knowledge was improving markedly during the 19th century, infant and child mortality still remained extremely high, with any child born to lower income families having a roughly 25% to 30% chance of dying before they reached their 10th year. Even so, Mary Ann and William Mowbray seemed to be particularly unlucky. All the more so when William himself died in January 1865 from an intestinal disorder. Suspicions seemed not to have been raised at this point. The fact Mary Ann was profiting from their demise also failed to raise eyebrows. In 1865, she received over £37 as compensation for the death of her husband and son from the British and Prudential Insurance Office. This equated to nearly half a year's wages for a labourer. Mary Ann did not wait long after the death of her first husband to marry again. She began working as a nurse at the Old Sunderland Infirmary. There, she cared for a man named George Ward. The pair began a relationship which quickly led to marriage. This was in August 1865, just 8 months after the death of her first husband, William. By this point, Mary Ann had only one surviving child of possibly 9 she had given birth to while with William Mowbray, a daughter named Isabella, who Mary now sent to live with her mother. This second marriage of Mary Ann's did not last anywhere near as long as her first. Just over a year after their union, George's health took a drastic turn for the worse. He suffered severe nosebleeds, with doctors telling Mary to apply up to 12 leeches to his body. These had little effect, and in October 1866, just 14 months after he married Mary Ann, George passed away. His illness had been characterized by a wide range of symptoms, including fever and stomach and intestinal problems, just like Mary Ann's first husband and children. However, in George's case, there was a plausible explanation for what had happened. The period between the 1830s and the 1890s in Europe witnessed 5 pandemics of cholera, which claimed millions of lives owing to poor sanitation and public health in cities across the UK and other countries. Consequently, it was assumed that individuals who died in the fashion which George Ward did had fallen victim to what was known as the Blue Death at the time. The fact that he and Mary Ann spent time at the infirmary would have cemented the idea that he had contracted a disease there. And so, his cause of death was recorded as English cholera and typhoid. As such, no suspicions arose concerning his demise, though Mary Ann yet again collected a large insurance payout, her second in 2 years, for the death of her husband. Within weeks of her second husband's death, Mary Ann acquired a new job working as a housekeeper in the home of James Robinson, a shipbuilder in Sunderland. He too had recently lost his partner. In November of 1866, his wife Hannah died, leaving him as the sole carer for their 5 children: William, 9, Elizabeth, 8, James Jr., 5, Mary Jane, 2, and 9-month-old John. Sadly, John died of gastric fever shortly after Mary Ann moved in, and James found solace in his new housekeeper. From this point, deaths began to mount rapidly. In March of 1867, Mary Ann was called away from her new beau when she was informed her mother had fallen ill. She wasn't separated from him long, however, as shortly after her arrival, Mary's mother Margaret died suddenly. It's said that while Mary did not benefit financially from her death, she made sure to collect as many items as she could carry to take back to the Robinsons' home, much to the chagrin of her stepfather, George Stott. It wasn't just items she found herself returning with, as she was forced to bring her daughter from her first marriage, Isabella, back with her. Her mother had been caring for Isabella, and it's unclear if Mary had told James about her beforehand. It seems that instead of embracing the union of families, Mary Ann was keen to wipe the slate clean. Over the course of the next 5 or so weeks, James Jr., Elizabeth, and Isabella all fell ill and passed away. Each had exhibited the same symptoms: stomach pains, vomiting, and seizures. A newspaper claimed that Isabella was so ill she at one point vomited in her mother's face, at which point she too fell ill, but quickly recovered. The fact that death seemed to follow Mary didn't go unnoticed. James would later state that he believed at the time of his children's deaths that Mary Ann was involved. However, he also said that he decided not to dwell on the matter. As time passed, it became clear that his housekeeper had fallen pregnant, and in August the pair were married. In November, Mary Ann gave birth to a daughter whom they named Margaret Isabella. Sadly, in February of the following year, she too would pass away. In June of 1868, Mary would give birth to their second child, a boy whom they named George. By this point, despite apparently suspecting that she had had a hand in his children's deaths, James entrusted Mary Ann with the family's purse strings, taking care of the money he brought home and paying any bills. So, when his building society contacted him to say he owed them the not insubstantial amount of £5, he began asking questions. As he pulled at the string, things began to quickly unravel, and it was revealed that Mary Ann had all but emptied his savings account, and his son James Jr. informed him she had also pawned furniture and items from around the house. These actions proved to be the final straw for James, and he arranged to meet with Mary to tell her that they were finished, but she never turned up. She had disappeared from the home and taken baby George with her. Where she, George, and indeed the money went after this point is unclear. Some sources say that she gambled the money away and was left to walk the streets after leaving James, while others claim she had squirreled the money away in preparation to run away with a man named Joseph Natras. He himself was a recent widower. Mary Ann would resurface in Sunderland on New Year's Eve in 1869. That day, she appeared at a friend's house, telling them she needed to send a letter and asking if they could take care of George while she did. They accepted, but Mary would never return for her son. George was eventually returned to his father's care. Early the following year, Mary Ann was contacted by an old friend, Margaret Cotton, the pair having met in their youth when both worked as domestics. She had recently moved into her brother Frederick's home after he lost his wife and 2 of his 4 children to illness. Margaret asked Mary to visit her and stay for a while, perhaps in an effort to support her friend during a difficult period, or maybe she believed her time working as a nurse may help ward off further deaths in the home. This would not be the case. Roughly 2 months later, in March of 1870, Margaret died after a short illness. Though Mary Ann's involvement in her death was disputed, this further loss pushed Frederick into an even darker space. However, Mary Ann was more than happy to comfort him. She had been working as a maid in the home of a local doctor, but by July she had been fired, along with a groom, after it was found that items had been disappearing from the house. With both seemingly in need, Frederick allowed Mary to move in and become his housekeeper, and the pair quickly began a relationship. Some sources believe that this coupling had its roots in their previous meeting earlier in the year, as by the time Mary moved in, she was once again expecting. Others believe the child may have belonged to the groom, who had also been expelled from the doctor's home. Frederick didn't seem to question the pregnancy, and in September the pair were married. Mary Ann added bigamy to her list of crimes, as she was still technically married to James. In February of 1871, she gave birth to a son she named Robert. The couple's neighbours were no fans of Mary, and the birth coming just 5 months after the marriage gave them ample ammunition to use against her. That was until tragedy seemingly struck. In September of 1871, a year after his marriage, Frederick suddenly fell ill at the colliery he worked at, and within 2 weeks he was dead. Almost overnight, Mary Ann was engulfed in a wave of support, as those who had initially seen her as a pariah now believed her to be a grieving widow. The pit company that Fred had worked for owned his home, and they now allowed Mary Ann to continue living there rent-free. Locals raised a fund for her, which the company contributed to, and she once again collected a hefty insurance payout. Before the year was out, Mrs. Cotton had accepted 3 lodgers into the home. Among them was one Joseph Natress, the widower who had been her lover. Some accounts state the pair were engaged. It may be easy to assume that this had been her plan all along, but her goal was much darker, and more deaths were to come. March of 1872 would see both Frederick Cotton Jr. and Robert Cotton pass away after a brief violent illness. Come April the 1st, they were joined by Joseph Natress. His death came so quickly that Robert's body was still in the room when he passed. These deaths once again saw money flow to Mary Ann, but by now the suspicions of those in the village had begun to rise. However, it would take one final death before Mary Ann's murder spree was brought to an end. By July, her only dependent was Frederick Cotton's last surviving child, Charles Edward. She made it obvious that he was not her child, and she wanted him gone. One person she made this desire clear to was a man named Thomas Riley. He was a well-known figure in the West Auckland community, and aside from being a farmer and butcher, he was also overseer of the local workhouse. Mary Ann wished for Charles Edward to be committed to the workhouse and taken off her hands. She told Riley that he had caused her to lose out on potential earnings, as she had a respectable lodger who wouldn't move in unless he was gone. It's believed by some that she may have been referring to an excise officer named either Richard Mann or Richard Quick Manning. There were rumours at the time that the pair were engaged. You can't say that Mary didn't move quickly. Thomas Riley informed her that Charles couldn't be sent to the workhouse unless she too was committed there. In a later statement, Riley would recall part of the conversation. "I suppose you're going to get married to Mr. Mann, the excise officer." She said perhaps it might be so, but the boy is in the way, but he will go like the rest. I said, "Nonsense, he appears to be a very healthy little fellow." Days after the refusal, on July the 12th, 1872, Charles Edward was dead. His death, much like the others, was recorded as being due to natural causes. That was until Thomas Riley made his suspicions known to authorities. Word began to spread among those in the village, and it seemed Mary Ann felt the net may finally be closing in on her. She began to sell items of furniture in order to build further funds. Before she could make her escape, however, news came back from the coroner. Though Charles had already been buried, the doctor who carried out the initial autopsy had kept the body's stomach contents. A test on these revealed the presence of arsenic. The following day, July the 18th, Mary Ann Cotton was arrested and Charles' body was later exhumed for further testing. By the time of her committal hearing, arsenic had been found throughout the boy's body, and Mary Ann was sent to Durham jail to await trial. While there, it was discovered that she was pregnant, and the decision was made to delay the trial until after the child's birth. The father of the child isn't known for sure, but when she gave birth, Mary named her new daughter Margaret Edith Quickmanning Cotton. When the case finally came before the court, Mary Ann was charged solely with the murder of Charles Edward Cotton, as the prosecution believed this was the best means of gaining a conviction. But as information was collected, it was soon being reported across England that Mary Ann had most likely been responsible for murdering many others, including 3 of her 4 husbands, her own mother, several stepchildren, and numerous offspring of her own. All the deaths seemed to match a pattern of the victim having developed a fever and severe stomach and intestinal cramps before dying. It was suspected that Mary Ann had poisoned each of them with arsenic, just as she had Charles Edward. The case caused a nationwide sensation, and these stories filled national newspapers. The trial began on March the 5th, 1873, with Mary's defence claiming that arsenic found in the bodies came from the deceased inhaling it from the dye used in the wallpaper hung in the home. It seems the jury didn't buy this explanation, and after deliberating for 90 minutes, they found Mary Ann Cotton guilty of the murder of Charles Edward, and she was sentenced to death. It's said that the convicted exhibited strong emotion upon hearing the verdict, but soon returned to her apparent habitual cold demeanour. She held a strong hope of receiving a royal pardon due to having recently given birth, but this wasn't to be. On March the 24th, Mary Ann was led to the scaffold at Durham County Jail, praying for mercy from God. A noose was placed around her neck, and moments later, she was dropped to her death. Instead of her neck breaking immediately, her body writhed as she was strangled to death. The hangman had rigged the rope too short, possibly on purpose. Over the years, after the initial furore had died down, the question of how many people Mary Ann had actually killed remained. While some believed she was involved in the deaths of her own mother and even Margaret Cotton, among many others, because the court case only looked into the death of Charles Edward, it's impossible to say for sure. Some, such as author Martin Connolly, who wrote the book Mary Ann Cotton, Dark Angel, believe she may have been involved in far fewer deaths, if any. He states that they occurred during a time when many diseases were endemic, with multiple deaths in a family being a common occurrence. He also points to arsenic being present in the environment, such as in the wallpaper, and this potentially being a contributing factor. But what do you think? Could Mary Ann simply have been incredibly unlucky? Or was she a woman who would kill anyone, even her own children, if she thought that she would benefit in some way? Let me know in the comments section below. Our next story is that of another Mary, Mary Blandy. And while she too killed someone close to her, she would argue she did so out of love. Mary was born in 1720 and grew up in a house on Hart Street near Henley Bridge here in Oxfordshire. She grew up as the only child of Francis Blandy and Mary Stevens. The family were well liked and respected by the local gentry. Francis was a lawyer whose skill saw him rise to not only become a person of some importance in the county, but also quite wealthy. His wife was described as an emblem of chastity and virtue, graceful in person, in mind, elevated. And Mary, who got her name from her mother, seemed to share these qualities. Mary was a clever, intelligent child who eventually became a well-mannered and well-educated young woman who had the ability to charm everyone she met. So it would be no surprise that many men vied for her attention. This number would only have swelled upon learning that Francis had set a dowry for his daughter. A dowry is a sum of money or property that the man who would become her husband would inherit upon marriage. Rumour had it was set at £10,000, an astronomical amount for the time. And so it was no surprise that many men approached Francis to ask for his daughter's hand. However, he found none of the suitors deserving of his daughter. That was until 1746, when Mary met Captain William Henry Cranston, a first lieutenant of Sir Andrew Agnew's regiment of Marines. While Francis had turned away soldiers before, and while this man was both unattractive and impecunious, Cranston was also the son of a Scottish nobleman, and thus, in Francis's opinion, worthy of Mary. When Captain Cranston then formally asked for his daughter's hand the following year, Francis was more than happy to give his blessing. He even invited William to live in the family home. Things seemed to be progressing well, but there was one slight issue. William Cranston was already married. One of Mr. Blandy's acquaintances was Lord Mark Kerr, who also happened to be Cranston's great-uncle. When he heard the news about Mary and William's plans to marry, he wrote a letter to Francis, letting him know that his daughter's lover already had a wife, a woman named Anne Murray, and a child living in Scotland. As you may guess, this revelation left Mr. Blandy outraged and ready to throw the deceiver out of his home. Yet Cranston was able to convince Mary and her mother that his marriage was just a misunderstanding and would soon be annulled by the Scottish courts. Whether it was her love for William or her fear that she would become a spinster, Mary decided to stand by her betrothed. In the spring of 1748, Cranston travelled to London, where he was to stay till the unhappy affair with his Scottish spouse was legally terminated. In the meantime, he and Mary maintained a passionate correspondence. However, the lovers suffered a significant setback on March 1st, 1748, when the Commissary Court decreed William Henry Cranston and Anne Murray were legally married. The deceitful husband was ordered to pay an annuity of £40 sterling for his wife and £10 for their daughter, causing Cranston, who was already strapped for cash, to fall into an even deeper financial crisis. Still, Mary's mother believed that the captain and her daughter were meant to be, even pleading with her husband to give them his blessing on her deathbed. Francis, however, had already concluded that Mary's Scottish suitor was more trouble than he was worth, and he had to go. At this point, Cranston informed Mary he had devised a plan to deal with her father's disapproval. He told her of Mrs. Morgan, a cunning woman known to him in Scotland, from whom he had received a certain powder. Cranston assured Mary that if she would mix this so-called love powder into something Francis ate or drank, his attitude towards her suitor would change from antipathy to affection. It is unclear if Mary believed what she was told, or if she knew what was going on from the start. Nevertheless, she was desperate enough to try anything to be able to marry the man she loved. In November 1750, Cranston returned to Scotland as his mother, according to him, had fallen extremely ill. With him, Cranston carried a generous amount of money given by Mary to help with his expenses. As she waved goodbye and watched her lover disappear into the distance, Mary could not have known it was the last time she would ever see her fiancé. In May of 1751, Cranston sent Mary a supply of the supposed love powder, along with instructions to mix the powder in tea. Mary did as she was instructed, also adding some of the powder to her father's food, and soon after, Francis Blandy became terribly sick. He began suffering from severe stomach pain, vomiting, and weakness. Curiously, the same thing happened to the family maid and charwoman. This would later be put down to them both eating some leftovers from Francis's meal. Despite those around her falling ill, it's said that Mary was blissfully unaware that this was down to her love powder. Her father grew increasingly ill to the point where Mary was forced to send for a local doctor. When she informed them of her actions, it didn't take them long to find the root cause of Francis's suffering, and they informed Mary that she may be found responsible for his poisoning. Fearful of possible repercussions, she burned the love letters sent to her by William, along with what remained of the powder. However, a maid named Susanna Gunnell managed to rescue some of the powder from the flames and send it to a chemist for testing. There, the love powder was found to be arsenic. Knowing that her father was not long for this earth and that she was the cause of his demise, Mary begged him for forgiveness. She told him about William's plan and the love powder, which she now knew was anything but. Despite knowing that his death was near, Francis found it within himself to forgive his daughter, even telling her not to speak of the poisoning so as to hopefully avoid arrest. This wasn't to be. Widely suspected of the poisoning, Mary soon found herself confined to her room, and on August the 14th, 1751, Francis Blandy succumbed to his illness. Distressed by this news and finding the door to her room open, Mary escaped and ran through the town, though she soon found herself chased by a mob of people before finding refuge in a nearby pub. She would later claim that this was not an attempt to escape, but her simply acting upon the distress she felt. Whether it was an escape attempt or not, Mary was returned home and placed in irons before being transferred to Oxford Jail to await trial. Of note, the irons can be seen in several illustrations from the time. Her trial took place on February 29, 1752, at Oxford Assizes, and it's said that Mary gave a characteristically intelligent and zealous defense of herself. She denied having poisoned her father, stating her belief that the powder was a love potion. The trial was also notable as it was one of the first times an expert had been put before the jury to explain forensic evidence. This was Dr. Anthony Addington, who had run the tests on the powder, revealing it to be arsenic. His evidence, along with that of several other witnesses, was enough to ensure Mary was found guilty of murder, going on to receive the mandatory sentence of death. On April the 6th, 1752, she would meet her fate in the yard of Oxford Castle Prison. Her gallows consisted of a wooden beam between two trees. As she was led to them, she asked the officials, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, don't hang me high." Upon the scaffold, draped in black, a noose was placed over her neck, hands tied in front of her to allow her to hold her prayer book. Once she had finished reading, she dropped the book, which was a signal for the hangman to drop her to her death. For most, this is where Mary Blandy's story ends. But over the years, decades and indeed centuries since her execution, there have been reports of Mary's ghost being seen at several locations around Oxfordshire, Berkshire and Buckinghamshire. Among the locations is, perhaps unsurprisingly, Blandy House. once home to the Blandy family. It is now a dental practice where several ghostly sightings have certainly been enough to make some say, "Ah." It's claimed Mary's ghost has been seen walking through the rooms beside the river and standing beneath a mulberry tree in the garden. As for Captain Cranston, upon learning that Mary had been arrested and that Francis's entire fortune was less than half the 10,000 dowry he had been promised, he fled the country to France. There, his health rapidly deteriorated, and in November of 1752, he passed away. His wife and child inherited some £1,500. A question mark hangs over the cases of the women in our next two stories. Firstly, we explore the case of the Pimlico mystery. Before dawn on January the 1st, 1886, 30-year-old Adelaide Bartlett frantically woke her landlord in the Pimlico district of London, announcing her husband had died in the night. While Edwin Bartlett had been ill for a long time, it soon became evident the 41-year-old had not died of natural causes, and what initially seemed like an open and shut case quickly turned into a sensational murder mystery. Had Adelaide really killed her husband? Much of Adelaide's early life is largely shrouded in mystery. She was born in either Orléans or St. Cloud, France, on December 19, 1855, and her mother was an Englishwoman named Clara Chamberlain. The identity of her father, however, is disputed, though records appear to show that he was a man named Adolphe Collot de la Trémouille, Comte de Troyes d'Escurial. The grand name seemingly came with a grand position, as it appears he was a member of Queen Victoria's entourage. By 1860, Clara and her children had moved to London, England, and in June of that year, Adolphe passed away. 6 years later, he was joined by Clara, who was only 33 years old. It seems that Adelaide was then adopted and later began working as a confectioner's assistant. However, her story really begins the day she was introduced to a prosperous grocer named Edwin Bartlett. Edwin was a businessman who was a partner in a number of grocery stores. He was also said to be spiritual and eccentric. These eccentricities, or indeed the 11-year age gap between the pair, weren't enough to deter Adelaide, and she and Edwin tied the knot on April the 6th, 1875. However, the pair didn't begin their life together as husband and wife straight away. Instead, Edwin sent Adelaide to a boarding school in Stoke Newington and then to a Protestant convent in Belgium to fill the gaps in her education, while he lived alone in a flat above his shop. In 1878, Adelaide finally returned to England, and she moved in with her husband at an address in Herne Hill. At first, life in the Bartlett household seemed to be going well. Edwin's business was flourishing, and the beautiful and smart Adelaide was seen as a perfect wife, although not by everyone. The young woman's father-in-law, Edwin Bartlett Sr., claimed he saw right through her, believing she was having an affair with her brother-in-law, Frederick. It was true that Adelaide didn't have many friends, and because Edwin Jr. worked long hours, she was often alone. Perhaps the young woman sought unorthodox companionship from her husband's sibling. Whether or not the accusations were true, Adelaide denied them, and Edwin believed his wife. The couple even forced Edwin Sr. to sign a written apology, while Frederick, interestingly, moved to the United States. In 1881, the Bartletts went through a traumatic experience when Adelaide gave birth to a stillborn child after a long and difficult labour. Protracted by the fact Edwin insisted that no doctor be involved in the birth, as he didn't want another man to interfere with his wife. Afterwards, Adelaide told her husband she never wanted to become pregnant again, and Edwin did not object. She would later state that their marriage was strictly platonic. Despite the apparent issue Edwin had with men around his wife, one man he seemingly trusted was George Dyson. Edwin and Adelaide were very religious, and in 1885 the 27-year-old Dyson was their local Wesleyan minister. The two men soon became close friends, and Adelaide and George were a lot closer than that. Edwin hired the minister to tutor his wife in Latin, mathematics, history, and geography. So teacher and pupil often spent the whole day together at the Bartlett home while the head of the house was at work. A maid would later say that the pair would behave like a smitten couple. Curiously, Edwin encouraged his friend to have an affectionate relationship with his wife and didn't mind seeing the two sharing kisses. In September, after the Bartletts moved to a room in a house at 85 Claverton Street, Pimlico, Edwin bought George a season train ticket so he could easily visit Adelaide, and allegedly regarded the minister as a co-husband of his wife. That same month, he also changed part of his will that stipulated that his wife could only keep the wealth and items she inherited from him if she remained unmarried. Along with these changes, he also chose a new executor, George Dyson. It was apparently Edwin's desire that after his death, George and Adelaide would be married. It's unclear whether he saw this happening sometime in the distant future, but in truth, Edwin didn't have much time left. In late 1885, Edwin's health suddenly took a turn for the worse. The man's teeth and gums were in terrible condition, as an inept dentist had left him with stumps that were now rotting away under dentures. Because of his foul-smelling breath, and perhaps for some other reasons, Adelaide was no longer sleeping in the same bed with her husband. She was, however, very devoted to taking care of Edwin, more so after Dr. Alfred Leach diagnosed him with gastritis and diarrhea likely caused by mercury poisoning. Some sources mention that Edwin believed he had syphilis, which he was self-treating with mercury, the remedy of choice at the time. Others, however, say Edwin was taking pills for his health problems, but didn't know exactly what they were. Regardless, he wasn't doing well, and his condition continued to deteriorate even after a competent dentist treated his mouth. Adelaide decided they needed to hear the opinion of another doctor, but for a rather curious reason. As she explained, if Mr. Bartlett does not get better soon, his friends and relations will accuse me of poisoning him. When a Dr. Dudley examined her husband, he explained that his gums were still inflamed, but otherwise there was nothing physically wrong with him. Believing he was simply depressed and hysteric, Dr. Dudley recommended his patient get out more. Edwin wasn't convinced. He still felt so ill, he believed he was going to die soon. But then, as the year was coming to an end, Edwin's condition started to improve, and he was slowly getting back to his old self. On December the 31st, 1885, Adelaide accompanied Edwin to yet another dentist appointment and was seen acting very affectionate towards her husband. She even told the doctor she wished she could unmarry Edwin so they could have the pleasure of marrying each other again. The pair celebrated New Year's Eve alone at home. Nobody had contact with the couple from 11:30 p.m. until 4 a.m. the following morning, when a frantic Adelaide stirred Mr. and Mrs. Doggett, the owners of the house, from their sleep. She begged them, "Come down, I think Mr. Bartlett is dead." The Doggetts found Edwin lying face down in the bed. The grocer's body was already cold, indicating he had been dead for some time. There weren't any clear signs of what had caused Edwin's sudden demise, and based on Adelaide's statement, it seemed like her husband had died in his sleep. The couple had gone to bed together, a rare occurrence at the time, and when Adelaide woke up that morning, Edwin was gone. Mr. Doggett did, however, notice a glass on the mantelpiece, which was 3/4 full of liquid that smelled like a combination of brandy and ether. Could it be that Edwin had taken poison to end his suffering? That question was posited to the now widow by Dr. Leach once he arrived to examine the body. She assured the doctor that that wasn't possible, saying she would have noticed if Edwin did such a thing. Certainly a post-mortem examination would conclude he had died of natural causes. But that was not the case. When the grocer's stomach was opened, the very distinct smell of chloroform filled the room. At low doses, chloroform works as an anesthetic and sedative, but in high concentrations, the substance can be fatal. By the end of January, the Home Office analyst had come to the conclusion Mr. Bartlett's untimely demise was caused by the toxic substance alone. The finding shocked George Dyson. The minister had purchased 4 small bottles of chloroform at Adelaide's request only days before the death. She had explained to George that her husband suffered from an internal complaint which his doctor didn't understand. To make Edwin feel more comfortable, she needed chloroform. Strangely, after her husband's death, she changed her story, claiming that despite their agreement to keep the marriage platonic, Edwin had begun to demand that the pair have relations. Whenever the mood took him, she would avoid the encounter by using the chloroform to knock him out. She continued by saying that on New Year's Eve she had not touched the chemical other than to show the bottle to her husband after admitting she had been using the substance on him. She then left the bottle next to the bed on the mantelpiece, but for one reason or another she didn't check the contents in the morning and simply threw the bottle away. While it was possible Edwin had chosen to take his own life, Adelaide's strange story and her relationship with George raised suspicions. Needless to say, Edwin Bartlett Sr. was adamant his son had been killed by his unfaithful wife. George seemed to think the same. After realizing he was connected to a possible murder, the minister told the authorities about the chloroform purchases, simultaneously ending his affair with the widow. Following the coroner's inquest, both 30-year-old Adelaide and 28-year-old George were arrested. But on April the 13th, 1886, at the Old Bailey, the prosecution withdrew its case against the minister, allowing him to be called as a witness in the case against Adelaide. One of the most talented and costly lawyers, Sir Edward Clarke, was brought in to represent the young widow. It was believed at the time that this was due to her mysterious father pulling strings behind the scenes. Though, if it was indeed Adolphe Trémoule, he had long since passed by this point. During the trial, the court soon learned that Adelaide's claim about having a platonic marriage with Edwin wasn't exactly true. The grocer had condoms amongst his belongings. Furthermore, Nurse Annie Walker testified Adelaide had told her she had become pregnant after one time being intimate with her husband without some preventative. During his testimony, George Dyson stated he had never behaved inappropriately with Adelaide and had helped her to get chloroform simply because he thought it would ease her husband's pain. He told the jury his friend had believed he was terminally ill, mentioning that Edwin had some odd ideas. Despite being brought in to help the prosecution, his testimony actually helped Adelaide's case, especially when he mentioned that she had not told him to keep the purchase of chloroform a secret. In addition, Dr. Leach described to the court the good care Adelaide had taken of her husband during his illness. Leach also explained that his patient's hysterical and unbalanced behaviour meant he couldn't rule out the possibility that he had taken his own life. There were also several other strange details about the case, such as the fact that despite eating a large meal, Edwin had not vomited after ingesting the chemical. Liquid chloroform also burns skin. However, no burns were found in the dead man's mouth or throat. This pointed to the possibility that he must have drank it quickly, adding to the theory that he may have done so to end his life. And so, even though the prosecution's case made a lot of sense, Adelaide had killed her husband to inherit his property and marry George, they struggled to prove how exactly she had murdered her husband. Sir Edward Clarke also noted there had not been previous murder cases involving the use of liquid chloroform, and it was more likely that Edwin Bartlett had taken his own life or died of a tragic accident. The widow's defence closed by saying, "From the moment of that death, every word and act and look of hers has been the word and act and look of a woman conscious of her innocence." In the end, although many details in the case were damning to her, the jury eventually found Adelaide not guilty of the murder of her husband. The foreman stated, "Although we think grave suspicion is attached to the prisoner, we do not think there is sufficient evidence to show how or by whom the chloroform was administered." After the verdict, and with questions remaining on how the liquid had reached the dead man's stomach without burning him internally, surgeon and pathologist Sir James Paget stated, "Now that she has been acquitted of murder and cannot be tried again, she should tell us, in the interest of science, how she did it." After her release, Adelaide Bartlett returned to Orleans, vanishing from the public eye and taking any answers she may have had to a list of unanswered questions with her. Some even claim that she eventually married George, but we can't say for sure. What we do know, however, is that the debate about what really took place that night continues. Did Adelaide offer Edwin a glass of chloroform-laced brandy as a New Year's toast, or did Edwin purposefully drink the toxic substance? Unfortunately, we will likely never know the whole truth about the Pimlico mystery. Lastly, we look at the case of Madeleine Smith, who, although many believe she committed murder, it couldn't be proven. In most criminal trials, when the jury returns a verdict, there are two possible outcomes, guilty or not guilty. But in Scotland, you may hear a third verdict, not proven. Not proven is a strange bit of legal wording with no specific definition and no different legal implications than the verdict of not guilty. In both cases, the defendant is acquitted of their crime and faces no punishment. Even the history of the verdict of not proven is murky. It likely dates back to the early 17th century, where juries were used to decide whether or not specific individual facts of a case had been proven. And then judges ultimately determined whether or not the defendant was guilty. One of the most notorious Scottish cases in which the not proven verdict was issued is that of Madeleine Smith, the Glasgow socialite who starred in a murder trial so scandalous that it remains an object of fascination to this day. In the early morning hours of March 23rd, 1857, Emile Longillier stumbled into his Glasgow lodging house, doubled over in pain. His landlady helped him to bed and summoned the doctor at 5 a.m. 6 hours later, Emile was dead. Inside his vest pocket was a letter from his lover asking him to meet with her secretly. When Emil's post-mortem revealed a lethal amount of arsenic in his stomach, Glasgow police set out to question the woman who had signed the letter, Madeleine Smith. Madeleine was the daughter of the prominent Glasgow architect James Smith. The family occupied a sprawling ground-floor apartment on Blythewood Hill, one of the wealthiest parts of central Glasgow. By all measures, Madeleine was a textbook example of an upper-class young woman. She took courses at Mrs. Alice Gorton's Academy for Young Ladies in London, accompanied her parents to parties and social gatherings, and was betrothed to a wealthy merchant selected by her father. But Madeleine was not as she appeared. In 1855, when she was 20 years old, she was introduced to Emile Longuelier, a local apprentice nurseryman. This role involved the cultivation and sale of plants and trees, a manual task seen as far below those within the Smith social circle. And though Emile was unsuitable for her in every way, Madeleine fell instantly in love. Emile's background was nothing like Madeleine's. He had been born in the Channel Islands to French parents who ran a small seed business out of their home. As a teen, Emile was sent to apprentice at a local nursery that catered to a British clientele. He learned English there and was eventually offered work on an estate near Edinburgh. When his employer died a year later, Emile was left stranded working on various estates until he moved to Glasgow in 1852. He was working as a packing clerk in a warehouse on Bothwell Street when he first spotted Madeleine, some 10 years his junior, and asked a neighbour to arrange an introduction. The pair began speaking frequently, and Madeleine's parents were fast to quash the budding friendship, forbidding Madeleine to see him any longer. If anything, her parents' disapproval only made her more interested in Emile, and the pair began an illicit secret affair, meeting unchaperoned at friends' homes, at Madeleine's bedroom window during the night, and in a wooded area near her home. The relationship was absolutely taboo. Not only was the apprentice nurseryman far below Madeleine's social class, but for a proper Victorian lady to have sexual relations with a man before marriage was unthinkable. If the affair had been discovered, her life would have been effectively ruined. To aid the secrecy of their relationship, she burned all Emile's love letters to ensure no one in the house would come across them and discover what was going on. As time went on, the seriousness of the forbidden relationship only increased, with the pair seemingly getting engaged, though this too was kept from Madeleine's parents. Their wedding was apparently meant to take place in September of 1856, and Emile did all he could to become acceptable to his fiancée's parents, to the point where he was set to take a high-paying job in Lima, Peru, until Madeleine talked him out of it. In a letter, she stated, quote, "My dearest Emile, I hope you have given up all idea of going to Lima. I will never be allowed to go to Lima with you, so I shall fancy you want to get quit of your Mimi. You can get plenty of appointments in Europe, any place in Europe. For my sake, do not go." Unquote. September came and went with no wedding taking place, and soon a new obstacle to their union would appear in the shape of a wealthy merchant named William Minnock. James Smith had met the 30-year-old bachelor on a business trip and thought him a perfect match for his daughter. With this, he began inviting Minnock to the Smith home, with the businessman eventually securing a flat above them, staying there when he was in town. Letters from Madeleine to Emile showed that she was initially cold towards the man chosen for her by her father, but as time progressed, her affection for him grew. Not wishing to hide anything from her lover, Madeleine was very open in her correspondence with him about her interactions with William. While this may not have been an issue during the early days when she actively disliked the man, as her feelings changed, these revelations only served to hurt Emile and inflame his jealousy. This culminated in January of 1857 when Madeleine accepted a marriage proposal from William Minnock. Madeleine knew that her family would never accept Emile as her husband, and she may never get such a promising proposal again. She needed to marry Minnock, and she needed to break things off with Emile. While she was open about William before, she could not bring herself to tell her already enraged lover of the engagement. Instead, intending to end their relationship, she tried to put it down to him returning one of her letters. Quote, "I felt truly astonished to have my last letter returned to me, but it will be the last you shall have an opportunity of returning to me. When you are not pleased with the letters I send you, then our correspondence shall be at an end. And as there is coolness on both sides, our engagement had better be broken. Altogether, I think, owing to coolness and indifference, nothing else, that we had better for the future consider ourselves as strangers. I trust your honour as a gentleman that you will not reveal anything that may have passed between us." Unquote. She went on to state that despite loving him once, her love had now ceased. She also asked that he return all of her letters. Instead of doing as he had been asked, the now jilted Emile threatened to reveal the letters to Madeleine's parents. She believed doing so would see her thrown out of the family, and so she now begged her one-time lover not to do so. The following weeks were marked by repeated attempts to convince Emile to turn over the letters, requests for a secret meeting, and a growing desperation to conceal her secret. By now, Emile heard rumours of the engagement, but Madeleine denied their truth. This back and forth abruptly ended on March the 23rd, 1857, when Emile suddenly passed away, with the death quickly becoming a source of local gossip and speculation. Undoubtedly, Madeleine learned of Emile's untimely demise soon after it happened, and on March the 26th, the family awoke to find that she was gone. William Minnock and one of Madeleine's brothers discovered her on a steamer bound for Roux, 25 miles along the River Clyde, where the Smith family owned a country property called Rowland. Madeleine told the men she had run because she was ashamed of something and worried her parents would be upset with her. After a brief stay at Rowland, the trio returned to Glasgow. By the time they returned, the police had discovered stacks of letters from Madeleine in Emile's room and office. These, along with the results of an initial autopsy, led to the socialite being arrested and charged with murder on March 31st. Naturally, there was widespread public interest in Madeleine's trial, so much so that it was moved to Edinburgh, where proceedings began on June 30th, 1857. The prosecution was allowed to admit Madeleine's letters into evidence, but not Emile's private diary, which contained entries about their meetings. When the contents of the nearly 200 letters were revealed, their often salacious nature shocked the puritanical Victorian public. In addition to sharing details about secret late-night meetings, the letters were full of stark expressions of desire and intimacy, leaving no question as to the physical nature of the couple's relationship. While the letters may have proven that Madeleine had motive for the murder, what convinced the prosecution she had committed it was the proof they had that she had purchased arsenic on 3 occasions leading up to Emile's demise. On Saturday, February 21st, Madeleine purchased a small amount of arsenic from a local apothecary, signing in the poison book that it was for use on rats. After a night out on February 22nd, Emile suffered a severe attack of stomach pain that left him bedridden for over a week. On March 6th, Madeleine purchased more arsenic from the apothecary, and again on March 17th, a third purchase. Emil went out of town on the 19th, but returned unexpectedly on the 22nd, telling his landlady that he received a letter calling him back. He asked her for a key to the front door, explaining that he expected to be out late. When he returned, he was already sick from arsenic poisoning. Due to laws at the time, Madeleine was not allowed to take the stand in her defense, but the deposition she gave to police upon her arrest was shared with the jury. In it, she claimed that she had not seen Emil for 3 weeks before his death. She did not deny their affair nor purchasing the arsenic. The defense was unable to produce any witnesses who could prove that Emil and Madeleine had been together in the 3 weeks before his death. Their storyline relied on Madeleine's letters, but only the envelopes were dated, and the discovery of multiple letters stuffed into a single envelope suggested that Emil may not have been a fastidious record keeper. There was no way to prove that the letters referred to meetings following Madeleine's purchase of the arsenic. Madeleine's sister Janet, with whom she shared a bed, testified that she did not recall Madeleine rising in the middle of the night on the 22nd. The defense presented expert witnesses who testified to the cosmetic use of arsenic, which lent credibility to the defendant's claims. But the defense's best argument was that Emil had a known history of dabbling in arsenic and had spoken of Sinister to a valet at least once. He had also spoken to a friend of wishing to seek revenge on Madeleine for choosing Minnock over him. And while there was a mountain of circumstantial evidence against Madeleine, the medical examiner had not explicitly checked to see if the arsenic in Emil's body was coloured, but did not notice that it was. At the same time, the apothecary testified that the product he sold had been coloured to prevent accidental consumption. The 9-day trial dominated the front pages of newspapers across Scotland. Crowds gathered at the courthouse each morning and evening to catch a glimpse of Madeleine, and her love letters were published for all to read. For her part, Madeleine was composed and quiet throughout the ordeal, refusing food and drink during the proceedings and showing only some discomfort when her letters were read aloud. She did not appear to mourn for her dead lover or be shocked by any of the allegations against her. On July the 9th, the jury deliberated for just 30 minutes before announcing their verdict. Not proven. The sentiment was shared by most. Madeleine Smith had killed her lover to avoid the affair becoming public, but without someone to testify to seeing them together, there was no way to convict her. Madeleine was never able to escape the stigma that followed the verdict. She left Scotland for London, eventually marrying George Wardle, the business manager of artist William Morris. She had 2 children with George, but the couple separated in 1890. After that, Madeleine's movements became a mystery. There is some evidence to suggest that she moved to New York, but where she died and when isn't known for certain. Madeleine Smith's innocence is still widely debated. There are some who think Emil Smith looked to frame Madeleine for murder and ensure her affair was revealed to the world. But many more think Madeleine was clearly the murderer and only got lucky enough to not be spotted with Emil in the weeks before his death. But why did she never make any attempt to collect the letters she was so fearful of being discovered? Did she assume that the belongings of a dead man would be of no interest to the police? She was, after all, an upper-crust socialite with little knowledge of how something as distasteful as an arsenic death at a lodging house would be handled. If you think that Emil subjected himself to a long, painful death in the vague hopes that it might be traced back to Madeleine is a far-fetched theory, you're not alone. Even Madeleine's legal defence, John Inglis, seemed to fall into the not-proven camp. When asked at a dinner party if he genuinely believed she was innocent, the lawyer responded that he would rather have danced than supped with her. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.